I would like to go over the assignment. I will also walk you through the steps involved, and I will be giving you the SQL code. We are joining three tables: the scholarships table, the members table, and the scholarships_students table. Those three tables will be able to give us the information to let us know what student was awarded what scholarship. There were 21 scholarships offered altogether. Notice I have my test echo statements being displayed, and the number 21 is coming from the row count. So when the page loads, we see all of the scholarships offered and whom the recipient is. When we scroll down, we have a form which consists of two drop-down select elements and a submit button. The first drop-down list, the values are generated from the database table. We are just hard-coding this drop-down list. However, even though the values are being hard-coded, we are still creating that form using PHP echo statements as we are with the submit button. The reason being, if there is an error and no values show up for the year drop-down list, nothing else will work properly. When the user makes a selection, we will click the submit button. The values will be posted back to the page itself, and this current table will be repopulated with the new values. So now we see 11 scholarships offered spring 2016. 11 spring in 2016 are all coming from the database or calculations from the database. Notice that we have formatted the amount column so that we have a comma and a decimal point and 2 zeros. It is possible that no scholarships were awarded for a specific semester, and therefore there will be a message concerning that. Scholarships were only awarded during the fall 2015 and spring 2016. I did not offer an option in the form to go back to showing all of the scholarships. If you wanted to figure out how to do that, you may. I would also like to point out that when we query the database and we are looking at the scholarships offered for fall 2015, we don't necessarily need to have the semester column and the year column. It is fine if you leave them in. If you would like to rework the code, you would need to use an if condition around those two columns in order to hide them when needed. The first thing you want to do when working with a web database is to design the HTML page. Most of the content you see here will be coming from the database. However, you need to understand the HTML layout so that you know where to insert the data. The chances are you probably have a lot more content on this page also, so you need to make sure that your elements that will contain the generated data work well with the rest of your HTML layout. The next thing you need to do is you need to test your connection before you start writing any other code. If the connection isn't there, it doesn't make sense to continue. So here at the top of our page, we have our connection information. We have our try-catch statement. Make sure that you have the correct database name, username, and password. Yours may differ from mine. The next thing you want to do is to test your SQL statement in PHP, assuming you have already developed it in PHP-MyAdmin and it does indeed work correctly. You can test it by looking at the number of rows returned and also by using the print_r function to show you the key value pairs in this array. There are two ways to work with a long SQL statement. You can break the statement up on multiple lines and concatenate each line as I am doing here. Make sure you leave one character white space at the end of the line so that the code does not run together. You also can bring it in right from PHP-MyAdmin in a nicely formatted manner and place everything between the opening and closing double quote. PHP will ignore all the white space. Either way works. We process our SQL statement using the prepare method executed from the connection object, storing it in a variable. I then use the execute method on the dollar statement. Now I get the row count by executing the row count method on my statement object, storing that in a variable, using my echo statement to show me the row count. The fetch all method will retrieve the result set as an associative array. And now I'm using the PHP print_r function, passing it the statement, which is the executed SQL, so that I can see my key value pairs. The next step is to put that data in a table or in other format. We are just displaying all of the data at this point when the page loads. We are not querying anything yet. So we will see all 21 rows, which represent the scholarships awarded. Looking back at our PHP code, we have already used the fetch all method to retrieve our associative array values, and we are storing that back into the dollar statement variable. That variable will be used in our for each loop so that we can retrieve the individual column values for every row in the table. We are using the if statement to make sure that we do have at least one row to be displayed. We are using PHP to create the beginning header of the table. Notice we have our escape character so that the source code looks nice. And now we are using the for each loop to generate the individual table row and table data HTML code and to place the value from the database column inside the opening and closing TD elements. Outside of the for each loop, we will end our table. We also have an else in the event that something happened. Next, we will need two drop-down select elements to query the database. We will query it by semester and by year. Because there are only 2 semesters, we can hard code that using PHP. However, we will retrieve the years from the database. So now we will set up our second SQL statement. Of course, we have already tested this in PHPMyAdmin, so we are selecting distinct year from scholarships. We will store that in a variable. We will use a prepare method, pass it that SQL2 variable, and use that result with the execute method. We can also test for the row count, and we can use our print_r function to test the associative array. And here we see our test echo statements. Our row count for the year is 2. We see the key value pairs in our associative array. Now that we have that second SQL statement, we will use it to populate our drop-down list when the page loads. And here we see it. Underneath our first table, we will place our drop-down list. We start out by making sure that we do have a row count using an if statement, and we have an else condition in the event that there is a problem. We first need to use the echo statement to create our opening form element. We create our label, the select, and the first option, which says make a selection. Next, we use the for each loop to create the option element for the values that are being returned from the table. So we are using $row and in brackets year because that is the column that will be the value in the option element, and in between the opening and closing option tag. Then we need to end the select, code in the input, and end the form. Next, we will hard code in our drop-down list for the semester. This does not need to be generated from the database because there are only 2 semesters, and they will not change. There will be more years in the future, so we generate years from the database. we're going to write it out using PHP. The reason being, if there's a problem, we don't want the page to load and just have a drop-down list sitting there. So here you see we have two drop-down lists. And if we look at the source code, we see everything is lined up very nicely. The next thing we need to do is to make sure that the user makes a selection. If they don't, we will give them an error message. So now we are posting the form back to the same page. So we have our if $_server and in brackets request method. Once we have this returning true, then we know that the form was submitted and we can start validating the form and creating the new SQL query that will change the values in the table. So we will retrieve the form values, store them in a variable, use a simple if to check the selection, and to give the error message if needed. If everything is okay, we will proceed with our code in the else section here. Now we need to construct our new SQL query, which will contain the where clause. So we'll go back into PHP-MyAdmin, and I will add the where clause. I will hard code in the value for semester and the value for year just to test. When we bring this into our PHP code, the value of fall and the value of 2015 will be expressed as variables. And now I can see that my code does indeed work. So now that we have determined that we have submitted the form, we will retrieve the two values from the two drop-down lists and store them in variables. Notice I have a test echo statement just so that I can tell what values are being returned. However, we can use the values from those variables later on as content on our page. I also have another variable, $semester_year, which is a combination of the semester and year, which makes it a little bit easier to put the content on the page. I have also initialized that variable to an empty string at the top of my page because that is now in the body section. The code in the else is writing our new SQL statement. We are using the variable $SQL. This will overwrite the original SQL that was executed when the page loaded. The only difference between this SQL statement is we are adding a where clause. So we have where semester equals a variable and year equals a variable. In our execute method on our statement, we will pass the values from the drop-down list to those variables. You also can just code those variables right inside the where clause, and then you just use the execute method without parameters. Both ways are valid and both ways work. Now we have our test row count, and now we are executing the fetch all method on our statement, which is going to return the associative array, which we will be using in our for each loop, which is inside the body of the page. I would like to point out that you could use the row count in your content telling the user how many scholarships were awarded. So remember, the page is being reloaded, so we're going to be reading all of the HTML over again. The only difference is this time, in our for each loop, we will be placing the values that are coming from the new SQL statement with the where clause. I would also like to point out that I have added the number format function to format our amounts column. If no records were returned, I give the user a message saying that there were no scholarships offered, and I will include for which semester and which year. So we are essentially rewriting the initial SQL statement after the form has been submitted. So when the page loads, we see all of the scholarships that were offered, and there are 21. We have also dynamically placed the drop-down list that contains the year, which was populated from the database. That happens when the page loads. The drop-down list that contains the semester was not generated from the database because it only has 2 semesters. So we hard-coded that, but we used PHP to do it. The submit button was also generated using PHP code. The reason being, if we were to not have values coming back from the year, it would not make sense to have the rest of the form on the page. Now I am choosing a year and a semester, and I will click the button. And notice my echo statements. It tells me the year is 2016, the semester is spring, the row count is 11. Notice my headings. Scholarships offered, spring 2016. The word spring and words 2016 came from my variables. As I said earlier, you could also incorporate the number. You could say there were 11 scholarships offered for spring 2016. So we're using content that has come from the database in our web page outside of this table also.